So why do we do public health surveillance? It guides immediate action for public health importance in those cases that we see. We get to measure the burden of disease. One of my favorites as an evaluator, we need this data to measure program planning, its implementation, and overall evaluation as well. We need this data to evaluate the policies that we've implemented. And finally, it provides the basis for epidemiological research. So these next three slides, thank you to Dr. Thrasher for sharing these with me today. We've got some national prevalence numbers. And the point of this slide especially is to identify what's happening with any tobacco product use. And we saw decreases happening in the mid-2010s up through 2015. But then we see this uptick. If you look at this very top line here, the solid bold line, we see upticks starting to happen after 2016. And you match that with the next bold dotted line, you can see that e-cigarettes match that quite well. There's a high degree of correlation happening here. So what's driving that any tobacco product use prevalence increase? We see that in e-cigarettes happening nationally. And so if we break this down with middle school students as well, looking at the different types of tobacco product use, we see decreases happening between 2011 and 2018. And these different shades of the bar graphs are the different years between 2011 and 2018. My apologies that the years were cut off. But we see decreases amongst all tobacco products except e-cigarettes. We see increases with e-cigarettes in the middle school population especially. And then we also see that what's driving any tobacco product use prevalence increase is related to e-cigarettes, and this is middle school population. So we see the same patterns as well with the high school population. Decreases amongst all other tobacco products, but increases in e-cigarettes as well. So where does South Carolina rank when it comes to national comparisons? This is from the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey online platform, where you can compare that surveillance data. You can compare one state to the next, as well as you can compare how we rank against the national average. So looking at ever use of e-cigarettes, how does South Carolina compare? We're right on par, or we're on par in 2017 here. We see the results. Let me go to the next one. I don't think this is the latest version of my slides, but I'm sorry that it's not as big there. You can see that South Carolina about 41% and nationally about 42%. And then you can determine if they are statistically different from one another. Do their confidence intervals overlap? No, they don't. And so we're right at national averages, or we're in 2017. So how do we rank with other tobacco products? When we look at e-cigarettes amongst our high school population and middle school populations here in South Carolina, we know that about 13.1% of our high school students are currently using e-cigarettes. And these are 2017 numbers. We know that conventional cigarette use is at 12%. Those are our latest numbers. And then smokeless tobacco use, about 9%. And what do these numbers mean? If we look at a room of us, maybe about 100 or 150, if there are 100 of us, 13 of us are using e-cigarettes, 12 are using conventional cigarettes, and 9 are using smokeless tobacco. And you could assume that there are some dual users in there as well. But when you extrapolate out to the total youth population, these differences between 12% and 13% could be hundreds or thousands. So the dual users, where are we when it comes to conventional cigarette users in our high school population that are also using e-cigarettes? And you can see this green line here on the line graph of where we've gone since 2011 of those dual users. And it could be misconstrued a little bit. The dual users, the denominator here is of those who are cigarette users. But if you compare it to something like the e-cigarette users, the denominator is the total population. So we've seen skyrocketing increases in the dual use rates, especially here in South Carolina. So what do we expect here in 2019? We're just about ready to wrap up our youth tobacco survey here at the end of the school year. We saw nationally with the National Youth Tobacco Survey between 2017 and 2018, there was a 78% increase of e-cigarette prevalence for current users. So if we were to extrapolate that out for South Carolina, we would expect e-cigarette prevalence rates for high school students being around 23 to 25% here that we expect in 2019. And those were 2018 increases. Could we be expecting an even higher increase here in 2019? And we'll have that data probably at the end of the summer, early fall, to be able to share. So what is susceptibility? Dr. Thrasher mentioned what does it look like for a never smoker to start initiating in smoking? And is that the same for initiation of e-cigarettes? And what we've done in the tobacco division through a preventive medicine student that did part of her residency at DHEC, she did a logistical regression analysis on looking at susceptibility, especially for e-cigarettes. And so we measure susceptibility through 3 different questions in the Youth Tobacco Survey. We ask, do you think that you'll smoke or use an e-cigarette within the next year? Do you think that you'll use those products soon? And if your best friend were to offer you an e-cigarette, would you use it? And so we use that as an index to measure susceptibility. And when we look at cigarette susceptibility versus e-cigarette susceptibility, we see these differences. And about 32% of our South Carolina high school students are susceptible e-cigarette users, or never users, that is. And I'm glad Dr. Thrasher touched on and actually gave a pretty robust presentation on e-cigarette marketing. Through that logistical regression analysis that our preventive medicine student did, she found 3 statistically significant covariates in her model. And the 3 were being of Hispanic ethnicity. That was a good predictor for e-cigarette susceptibility. It was exposure to e-cigarette marketing. And the 3rd predictor in her model was the amount of allowance that these students had per week. So the higher their allowance, the higher the predictable power it was for them to be e-cigarette susceptible never users. So we'll get into some hospitalization and emergency department data here next. So again, the hypothesis is that if we see increases in prevalence for e-cigarettes, are we seeing some acute health effects? And are they leading to ED visits as well as hospitalization visits? So what is the lay of the land in South Carolina? And so I use the ICD-10 codes for diagnosis related to dependence on nicotine as well as nicotine toxicity, both for emergency departments as well as hospitalizations. So before we get into the ED and hospitalization data, I think we do need to take it with a grain of salt before I present it. And I want to harken back to something that Brian King from the Office on Smoking and Health at CDC presented at this very venue several years ago. That he reminded us, as he was talking about e-cigarettes, that the vast public health burden is still related to smoking. The number of people that die from cigarettes nationally is about 480,000 per year. And let's not forget that. In South Carolina, we have over 7,000 people that die per year from smoking. And that doesn't include secondhand smoke exposure or cigarette-caused fires. The economic toll of smoking in South Carolina is over $2.1 billion for healthcare-related costs to treat smoking. So these are significant public health, epidemic, and disaster-relevant type metrics that we should never forget when it comes to the scourge of smoking on our society. But the issue is, if we see similar constituents from cigarettes in e-cigarettes, we had a presentation from a pediatrician, Dr. Lachlan Grant, who's here today, several weeks ago at the South Carolina Medical Association, who shared some important constituents that are also found in e-cigarettes. And one of them piqued my ear because it was polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and that's near and dear to my research heart. And we know that PAHs are the beginning of oxidative stress and chronic inflammation in the body, and those lead to cancers as well as other respiratory-related diseases such as COPD. So if these similar compounds are found, and the question is at what levels, they are of particular concern. So where are we when it comes to our emergency department visits and nicotine dependence admission rates? And what is of interest that we found is that in all age groups, other tobacco products, which includes e-cigarettes, in all age groups, those admission rates were increasing and almost doubling between 2016 and 2017. So again, this is dependence on nicotine being from other tobacco products, which includes e-cigarettes, and especially at the young age ranges, we see increases. And the importance here, when we talk about trajectory, is it includes both direction and magnitude, and the direction here is increase. And you compare it to something like cigarette dependence, where we see decreases in the younger populations. However, we still see increases in the older age ranges. So what happens when we look at toxicity as well? I wanted to actually suppress the toxicity data. We had some cell sizes less than 5, and it was important for us not to publish that. So we'll give an updated slide deck to you, Rebecca, here later. But when it came to hospitalization dependence, again, we're just looking at dependence, not toxicity to nicotine. We see the same thing as in the emergency department visits. Increases from other tobacco products in all age ranges, especially the younger age ranges, 0 to 17 and 18 to 24. But yet we see decreases when comparing to cigarette dependence or hospitalization visits. And so the assumption here is that if we're seeing prevalence increases, we could be seeing acute health impacts as well, and that is somewhat validated here with this data. So just a quick summary of what we've seen with the hospitalization and ED data specifically. As I mentioned, trajectory, it's important to understand both direction and magnitude. And all the magnitude, although it may not be at epidemic proportions from an acute perspective yet, we see the direction increasing. And that's an important baseline for us to be monitoring at this point. And it's also important to acknowledge that we're seeing decreases in all other tobacco products. We also included smokeless tobacco in this analysis, which I didn't share, but we saw decreases for all those age ranges as well. And so it should be mentioned that there are limitations to this data. Certainly, if we're looking at other tobacco products, there's some uncertainty there. Could it include other tobacco products that aren't vaping related? And that's certainly a possibility. And so that begs the question, why don't we have better diagnostic codes to enable our clinicians to better improve our population health surveillance? And that's one of the, I think, the sticking points that I've come across in preparing for this presentation, is that we need better diagnosis at the hands of our clinicians for e-cigarettes, especially for our younger populations. And furthermore, ICD-10 availability of data only goes back as far as 2016. If you get into ICD-9 diagnostic codes, they're even more nebulous and challenging to decipher for e-cigarettes. So as early as we can go is 2016. And then as late as we can go right now is 2017. Availability of data, especially when talking about the context of epidemics, is an issue and something that I think can be improved. And finally, I think this is a good dovetail into Dr. Alberg's presentation, is that when we talk about acute effects, that's one thing, but chronic exposure and latency periods for cancer is another. And so after several years of usage and chronic exposure to something like an e-cigarette, are we going to be seeing the chronic disease impacts as well?